You ever watch a movie that's so irredeemably awful that you hate the fact it exists, but don't entirely blame the director because the choice of him directing that movie was honestly just a horrible decision?
None of that ringing a bell.
Well, that was certainly the case with Guy Ritchie for me, as his last movie was maybe the worst thing I ever saw in the history of ever with the god-awful Aladdin remake. Nothing against him as a director, but I have no idea why they decided to choose the guy who directed Sherlock Holmes and that one King Arthur movie no one saw to direct a remake of an animated movie that was perfectly fine to begin with, that was also a genre that he's not experienced in, which is it being a musical extravaganza, and doesn't really seem like something that's up his alley either. Fortunately, little less than a year after that piece of garbage came out, The Gentleman isn't just a solid movie on its own right, but it's a good return to form for this director. This time it seems like Guy Ritchie was able to direct another big crime-driven R-rated gangster film that has less studio control over it, and it's very enjoyable with a decent story and some great performances, with Matthew McConaughey being the highlight easily. It has a lot of style to it, and while I don't find myself loving it, I still think it's a decent movie and a godsend compared to Guy Ritchie's last movie. I'm glad he was able to bring something so much better and so much what fans of his are probably used to, and after a few huge misfires. Hopefully he can make another stylistic movie in the vein of this. Just have him do a project that he's truly passionate about, instead of having him do something soulless like a Disney remake.
Reverse!
And so we come to the last movie we're going to be talking about that I saw at the drive-in, which also happens to be the first movie I saw at the drive-in, which is Tenet. And boy, this movie had a fascinating release, with this movie being one of the few movies that was destined to stay in theaters no matter what. But being still skeptical of going back to theaters, I had to opt in to go to the drive-in for this one, especially since that because Last Night in Soho was delayed till 2021, Tenet ended up becoming my most anticipated movie of 2020. I am disappointed that I didn't get a chance to see this in actual theaters in IMAX the way Nolan intended for his audiences, but given the circumstances, I was at least glad to see it before the end of the year, because God knows I don't want to end the year seeing this garbage, but not this. But with that out of the way, I will admit, for as big of a Christopher Nolan fan I am, I felt Tenet was a little bit of a disappointment. And this is coming from someone who thinks Tenet is still a decent movie in its own right, but when you compare it to Nolan's other work, it falls flat in a few regards. There are some things to be expected from Nolan that are consistently great, mainly the cinematography and the effects are really excellent. They do some ingenious work when it comes to some of these fight sequences, utilizing these reverse sequences, and the score, while not done by Hans Zimmer this time around, is still really awesome as expected. These are some of the things I come to expect from Nolan, and it's still really good. Where the movie loses me is honestly in its story and characters. This is something that Nolan has been criticized for with some of his past movies. His films are more about spectacles and interesting ideas as opposed to character arcs and developments. That's not to say that the people in his films do a bad job. In fact, I would say Nolan works really well with his actors, and they always give great performances even if the characters aren't really that interesting. Tenet isn't the exception to the rule, since you do see these actors give some really good performances here. Although this weak point does stand out more so than usual because I think the initial concept of this movie and the world Nolan is trying to create here just wasn't really fleshed out all that well. I can best describe this movie as a weaker version of Inception. Now, Inception, I think, is one of Nolan's absolute best movie, and it definitely felt like Tenet was trying to emulate the similar sort of feeling Nolan got out of Inception. It's a very similar aesthetic with men in cool suits and action set pieces that has very similar elements of time manipulation. Though the fundamental problem for me is that unlike Inception, Tenet's initial concept of this reverse time thing is not fully realized compared to what he did for the world of dreams in Inception. For anyone who says that Inception was too confusing, in the grand scheme of things, really isn't. In fact, I say that plot was easier to follow than this plot, mainly because it established what this world was from the get-go. And its world where you're able to go into the dreams is something that's very easy to grasp. It's something that anyone can really understand and relate to given the concept of dreams themselves. It also does a good job establishing the rules of the dream world and has us get to watch these characters in these really amazing action set pieces that are amazing to watch. And honestly, I don't think this whole reverse world Tenet tries to immerse us in is as relatable, and it's really just too vague in terms of what exactly this world is all about, to the point where I can't really get attached to this movie in the same way I did for Inception. But of course, since this is Tenet we're talking about here, it's kind of hard to fully explain here without going overboard, and I could maybe make a whole video on why Tenet is just a weaker version of Inception. Maybe things will change over time with Tenet for me, and maybe I'll watch this again and appreciate more of what Nolan tried to do here. And I feel bad because I probably complained more about this movie than I initially expected to. And I still actually recommend this movie because since it is Nolan, Tenet still has some very interesting ideas and set pieces. But as far as his overall work, it's definitely one of his weakest movies, and definitely one I would not recommend to newcomers of his work. A decent movie, but honestly could have been more. And this is coming from someone who considers Christopher Nolan as his second favorite director of all time. So take that for what it's worth.
Yes, rosebud frozen peas, full of country goodness and green penis. Wait, that's terrible. I quit.
David Fincher's Mink is a huge passion project from this director, especially since this was also written by his late father. Considering the consistently great work he has done over the years, Mink was looking to be one of the year's very best films because of that. To a great extent, this has a lot of what I expect from a period piece dealing with classical Hollywood. It looks and is structured very much like a film from that era with its black and white look, and even some imperfection with its audio make this film very much in line with the films of that time period. The performances are also great, with Gary Oldman giving a very good performance as Herman Mankiewicz, and it's pretty fascinating seeing how one of the most iconic films came to be, and more so from a writing perspective than a filmmaking perspective. It isn't quite as gripping as David Fincher's other films, which is kind of expected considering that this is a biopic where we know what's going to happen and not a crime thriller, though it doesn't have the snappy, well-written dialogue that we came to expect from something like The Social Network, which does bring this film a bit down from his other work as well. I am very glad though that David Fincher is making a movie again after half a decade since his last movie. And while I don't love it as much of his other movies, Mank is still a pretty engaging and enjoyable biopic surrounding classic Hollywood in a very authentic way. It is a movie totally worth your time, and the passion for it really does shine through thanks to Fincher and his team. Now here's hoping he'll bring us another excellent crime thriller very soon in the future.
This suit is black.
Okay. I'm not
Not.
Borat II as a sequel kind of weirdly exists in the same vein of The Croods 2, coming pretty unexpected during the pandemic and being a sequel to a relatively well-liked movie, now being released quite some time after the first was even relevant. But unlike The Croods 2, Sacha Baron Cohen and his team managed to make this character's comeback graceful and relevant to today's culture. Borat 2 is made in the similar mockumentary fashion that the first was known for, but it is arguably more fascinating. And yes, it is partially because this was shot during the pandemic. So seeing all this stuff unfold in real time and actually commenting on the major crazy things that happened in the past year, Borat 2 will stand at the very least as a good time capsule of that strange era in American culture. Though, even taking that out of it, it's still a pretty funny movie with a lot of character and even a surprisingly nice dynamic between Borat and his daughter. I think the original Borat still holds up very well as a funny social commentary, and this sequel's proved to do the same, just arguably more interesting due to the filming process. Only a matter of time till Borat, or whatever crazy character Sacha Baron Cohen can come up with next, will make a comeback for more crazy shenanigans against the insane old seniors of America.
It's not a quest, it's just a really fast and strange errand.
It's totally a quest.
I'll be blunt, I feel really bad for Onward. Not only did this movie came out at the worst possible time, but this movie also has gotten kind of a bad rep as it's seen as a not so good Pixar movie, which, in my honest opinion, I don't think that's the case at all. That's not to say I don't think Onward is up there with the very best Pixar movie, not even the best Pixar movie of this year even. But for me, I would say this movie is pretty standard Pixar. This is a story of an unlikely duo going on an adventure, but this also feels like a standard Pixar movie in quality, as I feel very similar about this movie as I do with something like Monsters Inc. or Finding Nemo. Both of those movies I think serve their purpose very well as being really fun duo adventure stories. The issue I feel people have with this movie is that this doesn't go as deep as what we've gotten from Pixar recently. And Onward is mostly consistent as just this little adventure film, but that doesn't mean I think this movie is poorly done. While Onward doesn't go as deep or as emotionally impactful as other Pixar movies, I think it still manages to be pretty solid, as I think the characters of Barley and Ian are good protagonists that do get a little bit of development, and even the minor characters like the Manticore and their parents still manage to leave a bit of an impression despite them not having huge roles and, well, their dad also being a pair of legs. Throughout the runtime, I think it manages to be a consistently enjoyable movie, but the real reason why Onward made the list really just comes down to its ending. The journey Onward gives is a fun one, but when it does get to that Pixar heartfelt moment, I think it manages to fulfill it perfectly. Without revealing too much, it manages to be a very impactful sequence from a character perspective, and it was even built up to very subtly, and it's just an all-around satisfying conclusion to this adventure that honestly I could not have think of a better way to have ended this story. Onward might be a standard Pixar adventure for a good majority of it, and compared to their other works, it's not their strongest, but with its likability and an excellent ending, make it a really good example of what a standard Pixar movie should be like. I don't know if a sequel will happen, but either way, I'll still look back on Onward as this really charming adventure movie that I'm honestly glad to say this was literally the last movie I saw in theaters.
Bombard many things to make we a new home on the moon.
Over the Moon can be best described as having the same sort of appeal as a Don Bluth movie. In other words, this is the exact kind of movie that definitely wants to replicate the kind of emotion and feel that a lot of Disney movies have in the past. Given that this is a project from iconic veteran Disney animator Glenn Keane, I think that's to be expected from a project like this. Also, like the Don Bluth movies of that time, this succeeds in replicating a Disney movie very well in more ways than one. For one, the animation is phenomenal, with the world of the moon in this film being some of the most vibrant and expressive animation all year. And this movie even has some beautiful 2D segments at point. Then again, I expect nothing else from the guy who animated some of the most iconic Disney characters. The songs are pretty decent too, and they work very similarly to a Bluth film for me, as most of them I don't tend to go back to, but they still work really well for the story and are pretty solid songs as a whole. If I had to pick one highlight, it definitely would be the first song from the Moon Queen, which slaps pretty hard actually. It doesn't take as many risks as some of the very best animated films of this caliber, but the effort is shown big time throughout the entire movie. It's a movie with a lot of artistry and passion behind it that even has a good amount of emotion by the end. If you have Netflix and haven't watched it yet, give it a watch. It's great to see them give animators creative freedom to make these really neat films, and we need more stuff like that. Seemingly, this might be the decade for that, so please support as many animated projects on streaming as you can, especially when they have so much passion behind them like this does right here.
Hey, remember me? That big charity bash gosh, a few years back, I was the clown girl holding the gun on ya!
Here it is, single-handedly, by no fault of its own, the best comic book movie of 2020. I'm gonna be honest here, I seriously did not expect this to be as high on the list as it is. What started out as one of the first box office flop of 2020 somehow turned into one of the biggest success stories, with this being the only real comic book movie to get a theatrical release. And that's how Birds of Prey became the best comic book movie of this year.
This is how I win.
And honestly, there's a lot to love about this movie for me, as this is the exact kind of thing I look for in a comic book movie. Stylized direction, over-the-top rad action sequences, and a ton of personality. I think Kathy Yang and her team has brought a lot to this film, as this is the lowest budget film in the DC cinematic universe, leading to not much of a reliance on CGI and instead just raw, fairly violent, and over-the-top action. Plus, coming from a bit of a personal bias, Harley Quinn just so happens to be my favorite character in all of DC. And this movie absolutely brings her justice. Not just in the action sequences, but Margot Robbie was able to bring a lot more personality and depth to her, with her actually taking into account her independence against the Joker. She's still pretty psychotic, but much like the original character, she managed to enjoy every little bit of it. And it's good to see that. She also works off great with the Birds of Prey themselves. But I am inclined to agree with some critics that this movie really should have been called Harley Quinn and the Birds of Prey instead of putting the Birds of Prey on the front line. Harley is the main focus, and we don't get much development and screen time with the Birds of Prey themselves. That's not to say I didn't like any of them. They all work off of Robbie very well, and even have their own moments to shine. The highlight of the team for me being Mary Elizabeth Winstead, who wants to be this stoic badass with a crossbow, but still has some social awkwardness to her, and I absolutely love it.
Do you know who I am?
Plus, this is a movie where Harley Quinn and Ramona Flowers team up during a motorcycle chase scene. How can I not fall in love with this? There are other faults here and there, namely being that in terms of comic book accuracy, you may be disappointed with how some of these other characters are represented in this movie, and the narrative can be a little clunky, as it tends to jump around a lot regarding the MacGuffin they have to get in this film, which can feel a little bit repetitive. However, the direction and execution of this movie more than makes up for it. Anyone who says this movie is worse than Suicide Squad is absolutely wrong, especially given all the energy Birds of Prey has and how this manages to be an improvement on giving Harley Quinn a proper movie. Even though I was a little bit disappointed with Wonder Woman 1984 compared to the first, I think Birds of Prey being a vast improvement over Suicide Squad definitely makes up for it for me. I've seen more and more people discovering it and loving it. This will be seen as one of the first major cult movies of the 2020s. It's a blast of an action film that's small in scale, but makes up for it with so much style and character that I appreciate in a movie like this. And this just makes me more excited for more future projects from DC, where they can let their directors be creative and fun while also giving us variety that we've been clamoring for with comic book movies for a while now. And between this and James Gunn's version of the Suicide Squad coming later in 2021, this is the kind of stuff that makes me hopeful for DC's future in the 2020s.
I'm Kermit the Frog, and I told you I want my Kermit the Frog t-shirt!
The other major documentary that I watched in 2020, Feels Good Man, stands as one of the very best documentaries I have seen in quite some time. Not only is this a very informative piece on internet culture, and one that I think puts things into perspective perfectly, but it's actually a really touching story at its core about an artist and how one little thing they made can lead into something completely unlike anything they would initially expect from it. If you don't all know already, this is a documentary on Pepe the Frog, and what was initially seen as some little meme turning into a representation of the dark side of the internet. A movie like this could easily be tone deaf, with it not understanding why internet memes have such a universal appeal. Fortunately, the team behind this documentary really did their research, and it becomes a really fascinating case study on what could prompt something like this to exist. And unlike The Social Dilemma, this movie doesn't try to have some scripted narrative to emphasize their point further in a way that felt ham-fisted. Instead, it relies on actual situation with Matt Fury and the interviews from real people with something substantial regarding to the topic. The closest thing that there is in this movie is that there are some animated moments here and there, but they're actually really visually engaging as they add a lot of emotion to the tone certain points of this documentary is trying to convey. For me, it made me feel sympathy as I felt really bad for Matt Fury in all of this. This is just a creative mind wanting to get by, only for him to get wrapped up into this toxic culture that he couldn't control. From something as simple as his basic stoner comics he did with his friends in college. He never intended for this character to be this hateful symbol. He was just making stupid little fun comics for laughs with his friends, and it really makes me feel bad for him, but also very glad when we see more positive things taking action in his life regarding this character. If you're into documentaries, or if you're looking for something to be a bit more informed about internet culture without going into trendy clickbaity sites, this documentary comes highly recommended. It's an authentic and fascinating look at such a strange part of our culture. And by the end of it, it becomes exactly what the title suggests. It feels good. And man, this was easily one of the biggest surprises of the entire year for me.
I've never experienced anything like it. I'm thinking of ending things.
The film that most critics would probably state is the best movie of 2020. And I can definitely believe it. I'm thinking of ending things from Charlie Kaufman, the mind behind Anomalisa and writer of many other thought-provoking films like Eternal Sunshine and Being John Malkovich. If you're familiar with any of his work, you would know that Kaufman is someone who makes films that are up for interpretation and are very experimental in structure and character. The movie about a woman visiting her boyfriend's parents' house while contemplating a breakup doesn't really sound that interesting on a surface level, but as the film unfolds, this becomes a deep dive into someone's entire life. Certainly not an upper of a film. In fact, with a title like I'm Thinking of Ending Things, I don't expect it to be. Yet, like a lot of films that tackles issues of depression, there is a lot to take away from this movie, where it really sticks with you, even after only seeing it just once. The way time is manipulated, the visual cues, and even the title itself having a double meaning are all things that help make this brilliant piece of work from Kaufman so emotionally investing. It's not for everyone, but those who are willing to find one of the most poetic and deep films of the year, it's certainly one I am game to watch again at some point, and will probably get a lot more value from it on a second viewing. Minds like Charlie Kaufman are the kind we want to see from talented filmmakers, and the kind of films we get as a result are ones that make me glad that we get filmmakers that provide film fans with some of the most experimental and thought-provoking films in the entire year. Let's hope that I'm Thinking of Ending Things does get at least a little bit of recognition at this year's Oscars, whenever that's gonna be.
Wolf, wolf, hunt them far and yonder.
From the studio that made Secret Kills and the other Oscar-nominated anime films you probably missed out on, Wolfwalkers is a strong contender for the best animated film of 2020, and maybe even the best movie from Cartoon Saloon. Every film they have done has done a great job of making 2D animation relevant again, in an age of computer animation being the most prevalent still. Wolfwalkers is no exception to this role, as this is one of the most beautifully animated films of this caliber in quite some time. Every drawing has so much personality and craft, with the characters feeling so alive and the backgrounds being akin to something out of a children's book. What makes Wolfwalkers even better than some of Saloon's other movie is that they made a film with a lot of atmosphere and maturity to it. This takes all familiar tropes and making it more engaging by giving us with not only two great leads with Robin and Maybeth, but Wolfwalkers is a movie that isn't really afraid to be darker and more serious in tone throughout most of its runtime, giving us a really emotionally investing story. It tackles on themes of religion and extremism in very subtle ways, to where even despite essentially being a kid's movie, it does not feel like one at all. That's not to say that Cartoon Saloon's other work didn't offer any of that, but Wolfwalkers has all of these elements heightened at its best. It's emotionally gripping and beautifully immersive. If there's any reason that you should maybe check out Apple TV, it's for the incredible work that the makers of this movie provided. With all the praise this movie has gotten, really makes me hope that the future will end up being very bright for Cartoon Saloon. If you have a chance to check out this incredible piece of animation, do so. And while you're at it, check out the other movies done by the studio, as they are also worth your time. Any movie that really showcases why 2D animation is so beautiful and profound should be required watched for anyone who wants to have an appreciation of film.
And I swear the next thing I know, it's like he floats off the stage. That guy was lost in the music. He was in it. And he took the rest of us with him. That's when I knew I was born to play.
Honestly, it was really between this and Wolfwalkers as my #1 favorite movie of 2020. But ultimately, Soul wins in this category because of how it manages to be everything I hoped for and more. This was initially one of my most anticipated movies of the year before the pandemic, since this was looking like Pixar would potentially give us another quality movie in the vein of Inside Out and Coco, and Soul definitely fulfilled that hype. And while I don't quite find it as emotionally investing as either of those two movies, Soul manages to hold very well on its own by having a surprising amount of intellect to it. Essentially, Pixar took a premise that you would see in an 80s or 90s comedy and execute it in a way that makes it feel like a really well done indie film from the 2000s or the 2010s. It's due to a number of different factors, namely the writing and directing feeling a lot more adult-centric than for kids, and in the best way. The sequences on Earth are shot and edited to the point where they feel very authentic to real life. Add in some great dialogues with characters that feel real, and even some incredible animation that continues from Toy Story 4's reflection of how far we have come from CGI animation with how real everything looks. This isn't to say that the other half with the spirit world isn't filled with creativity. Its more stylized and outer-worldly approach makes it a sight to behold. In fact, I would say the perfect contrast is right down to the music, with The Great Before having a very electronic yet atmospheric sound to it from Trent Reznor, with The Real World having a upbeat jazz sound to it from John Basti, giving this film a strong sense of sincerity. And while I'm at it, this movie has one of the strongest Pixar protagonists, with Joe Gardner being easily one of the most likable and relatable characters they have ever done. His passion and love of music makes him instantly genuine from the start, and even when he has his more selfish moments, it still comes from a place of understanding and helps him become more of a layered character when he learns through his journey as a soul. The movie's method of showcasing the appeal of living life and finding what you can offer to others comes from a place of heart, and Pixar managed to go a little deeper with this idea than even I initially anticipated. For those who had a rough year like a lot of us, I think it's safe to assume that Soul was one of the highlights, and even though it's just a movie, I think its whole journey about discovering yourself was something that anyone can relate to, and them doing it in a way that's just as clever and powerful as we would like to see from Pixar. I say this would be a perfect way to end off the year. If you haven't watched it yet, it comes highly recommended. As someone who has slowly been trying to get back into the swing of making videos and doing what I love, Soul is the exact kind of movie to give you that spark. Even if this year hasn't gone as planned, I think this is the right mindset to get into in the future. In a world where sometimes it can feel very pessimistic, whatever positive energy like the stuff Pixar puts out can help give us a stronger sense of optimism that is much needed for everyone. I'm glad that even despite the struggles 2020 had to offer, This movie and so many others helped me regain a sense of passion that I've wanted and have wanted to do for quite some time. Even if it's not the way I expected, I plan to make this year even better when it comes to providing new content. Take care, and here's to the new opportunities that 2021 will have to offer. Oh, and before anyone asks, no, Hamilton is not on the list because it's not a movie. It's literally just the play, and they filmed it on screen and put it on Disney+. Stop acting like it's a movie just because there weren't that many movies that came out this year, please.